Hi everyone, I'm Brenda Winkle. Last week on the blog post, my topic that I was writing about was on personal boundaries in COVID-19. In fact, that was the title of the post. I had the most response from that blog post that I have ever had from any blog post. And I was trying to think this morning how many years I've had the blog post, but it's a long time. 6, 7, 8 years, not sure, at least 6 years, maybe more. This topic brought more response from you than anything else I've ever talked about, which made me think I probably need to dive a little bit deeper into this topic. And so I have done that, and I've done a little bit more homework for you this week and homework for myself too, because this is really an important component of the book that I'm currently working on. And so there were a couple of themes that people wanted to talk about. One thing that came up was, how do I set my boundaries? Because I used to use work as a boundary, and so there was a physical boundary, as in I wasn't in the home, and so I could create some time and space to do whatever it was I needed to do because I was gone. And that has kind of, as we know, that has been eliminated with COVID-19 and all of us living and working from home for a lot of us. The second theme that came up for people was, what do I do when someone isn't hearing my boundaries? And when do I know if I'm in trouble, if it's a red flag? Those are two really, really different questions. And I will be honing in on each of those questions because they're really important. And I think there are some simple answers for those questions. But before we do that, I thought it would be useful to reestablish some things about boundaries. And so I have pulled out some resources for us today. And one resource that we're going to be using comes from a book called How to Be an Adult, a Handbook on Psychological and Spiritual Integration by David Richo. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that correctly. That is a good resource. And then we're also going to, well, let me just do that part first. So in his book on how to be an adult, he has a segment on maintaining personal boundaries. And there's a checklist of how we know when we are giving up our boundaries and when we have our boundaries intact. So I just want to give you some time to marinate on that thought for a moment. We do oftentimes give up our boundaries. We stop holding firm on them, and that can happen for a lot of reasons. That can happen because we're tired. It can happen because we're stressed. It can happen because that's what's been modeled for us. It can happen because we're with an abuser, and the abuser continues to chip away at our personal boundaries. And it can happen with any combination of all of those things. So I want you to think about some clear and unclear some boundaries. So if you have given up on a boundary in a personal relationship, you might be unclear about your preferences. An example would be, what would you like for dinner? I don't know, it's up to you. You've given up your boundary. You've given up your preference. And it might be on little things like what you want for dinner. It might be on big things like where you want to live. So an example of the healthy boundary would be to have clear preferences and act on them. Another thing that David Richo tells us is, do you notice, or excuse me, an unhealthy boundary, don't notice unhappiness, since enduring it is your concern. You just kind of tap it down. Don't worry about being happy. When you have healthy boundaries, you are able to recognize when you are happy or when you are unhappy. So if you're kind of ambiguous and you're thinking, gosh, I'm not sure, am I happy right now? It could be that you have kind of given away your chance to choose that. Another thing that he tells us is, you might be living reactively, and in doing that, you might be altering your behavior, plans, or opinions to fit the current moods or circumstances of someone else. When you have clear boundaries, you can acknowledge the moods, and the circumstances around you, but you remain centered. In other words, you're living actively from where you feel a sense of groundedness and centeredness and making choices for what is right with you while noticing and paying attention to how the other person or other people are reacting, but not necessarily letting them impact you. That is not selfish. That is one of the biggest things I think that we, especially as women and educators or mothers or nurses or other kinds of caregiving types of roles, we get really stuck in that and thinking that we own the responsibility to fix someone else's mood or circumstances, and we don't. That's part of healthy boundaries, is noticing it and then still being able to make the choices that we know are best for us. Another thing that David Richo mentions in this book, in maintaining personal boundaries, his book is called How to Be an Adult, is if you continue to do more and more for less and less, that is an example of giving up your boundary. I'm thinking right now about all the educators across the country who are doing this. Oh my goodness, this is a topic for another blog post, but this is a good example of giving up personal boundaries. A way to have healthy personal boundaries in that circumstance would be to do more when that gets results. There's a really big difference there. Listen to those again. You do more for less and less, or you do more when that gets results. That's so huge. So think about that one. That's a big one for those of us in the field of education right now. Another one is if we have an unhealthy boundary or we have given up a boundary in a personal relationship, it might be that we take as truth the most recent opinion you have heard. Whoever was the one that was last talking, that's the opinion. That's the truth. Well, that can be problematic depending on who you were just speaking to. When you have healthy boundaries, you are trusting your own intuition. You're trusting your own gut while being open to others' opinions. There's a big difference there in being able to formulate your own opinion. Number 6 on David Richo's list of a checklist of healthy boundaries in a personal relationship. Living hopefully while wishing and waiting is an example of giving up your personal boundary. Now, I realize in times of pandemic, this one's hard because it might be difficult for us to find hope in all of this. But here's an example of having a healthy boundary. Living optimistically while co-working on change. Oh my gosh. How empowering does that feel? Living optimistically while being part of the change. That feels so much better instead of wishing and hoping. If you have unhealthy boundaries or you have given up your personal boundaries, you might be satisfied with coping and surviving, as opposed to a healthy boundary where you're only satisfied if you are thriving. Oh my goodness, this is a big one. And this goes back to a lot of the people I spoke with, texted with, emailed with, and messaged with after last week's blog post. If you are satisfied with only coping and surviving, you have given up your personal boundaries. And a way to have an intact, healthy boundary in your personal relationship would be to only be satisfied when you are thriving. That's big. Number 8, let others' minimal involvement maintain your stalemate. As opposed to in a healthy boundary, or when your boundaries are intact, you are encouraged by sincere, ongoing change for the better. It's okay to have conflict. It's okay to need to work things out, as long as the people or person you are working things out with is also working towards positive change. If you have given up your boundaries, you might have few hobbies because you have no attention span for any self-directed activities. Whereas if you have intact boundaries, you'll be excited because you have interest in self-enhancing hobbies and projects. Now, this list goes on and on. It's so cool. I highly recommend it. Again, the book is called How to Be an Adult, a Handbook on Psychological and Spiritual Integration by David Richo, R-I-C-H-O. I hope that I'm saying that correctly. So be thinking about those things. And then I want to reference one other book. And I realized that I've been now talking for a long time, a lot longer than I had planned. But this is big. This comes from a resource called Civilized Assertiveness. Assertiveness is something that we can use as we are learning to really keep our boundaries intact and keeping those healthy boundaries in place. And so there, in this book, Civilized Assertiveness, there is a bill of personal rights. I said that backward. A personal bill of rights. And number one on this list is to express thoughts and feelings without qualification or apology. That is a personal right that you have. Now, you also have the right to have your thoughts and feelings and rights respected. You have the right to be listened to and taken seriously. You have the right to ask for what you want. You have the right to make mistakes as long as you take responsibility for them. You have the right to ask for information no matter how much you think you should already know this. You have the right to say no without apology or excuse on any topic. You have the right to make a decision on your own terms without having to justify or explain. You have the right to not feel guilty over choosing your rights and your needs over someone else's. I said that badly. Let me try this again. You have the right to not feel guilty about choosing your needs over someone else's. If you don't take care of you, you have nothing else to give. Think about that. Those of you that are in caretaking professions and roles, that's really big. And number 10, you have the right to choose not to be assertive. You have the right to not do anything on this list if that's what serves you. So as we move forward, I think that we need at least one more conversation on boundaries. And that conversation is going to be around how do we make sure that we are keeping other people's boundaries intact, that we're not becoming boundary busters ourselves. But in order to do that, I really wanted to lean into what it takes to have healthy boundaries. Now, healthy boundaries do not make you mean. It is not mean for you to expect to go to the bathroom by yourself. I'm talking to those of you with small children out there. It is not mean of you with teenagers to expect that your teenager does not throw trash all over the house. That's not mean. That just keeps the bugs away. It's not mean of you to go to bed when you're tired and get the rest you need. That's not being mean. I could go on and on about boundaries because this is something I have done a ton of work around in my personal life. I would love to hear from you because this has just spurred so much thought and so many wonderful conversations over the past week. I'd love to know, are you somebody who works really hard to keep your personal boundaries intact? And what do you find is a roadblock or an obstacle for you in doing that? Or are you someone that boundaries are hard? They're really hard. And they're hard for any number of reasons. And if they're hard, what makes them hard? I think I might have just said the same thing twice. I guess that's what's on my mind. And if you're someone who has boundaries that are easily intact, you keep your boundaries really, really pure, you don't really struggle with this, I'd love to hear from you. I would love to know if you work consciously to keep your boundaries intact, or if it is so habitual that you just are able to do it kind of effortlessly. I would love to know what that's like for people. For myself, I will tell you that I have gone from both extremes. When I was in the tail end of an abusive marriage, I had almost zero personal boundaries, almost none. And that manifested in a lot of different ways. One of the ways that it manifested was because I did not have personal boundaries, I did not see or recognize other people's personal boundaries. And so I think it was probably difficult to be my friend. at that time because I didn't necessarily see a line of separation between myself and another person. And the stronger my personal boundaries became and the more intact they were, the more I noticed that the people who I was spending time with also had intact personal boundaries. So I'm going to be sharing some stories in the coming weeks about boundaries, things that I've learned and how I learned them, in addition to sharing more resources with you from boundaries. In the meantime, I loved hearing from so many of you last week about boundaries, and I would love to keep that conversation going. And if you have other things that are on your mind or on your heart, please reach out, because that connection from you just absolutely made my week. I am not immune to the loneliness that COVID-19 is bringing for so many people, where we are really craving a human interaction and a dialogue, whether it's over social media or technology or over the phone. So all my love to you.